Welcome, I'm Glen Anderson, producer and host of this TV series, Glen's Parallax Perspectives. This series explores a wide variety of issues related to peace, social and economic justice, the environment, and nonviolent social change. We especially provide opportunities for the public to hear voices and viewpoints that are rarely heard in mainstream media. Mainstream media, politicians, and culture see the world in conventional ways. The establishment is stuck in how they see the world. In order to solve problems, we need to see things differently. This TV series, Glen's Parallax Perspectives, can help us see things differently so we can solve problems at all levels, from the local to the global. This series is called Glen's Parallax Perspectives. Here's what the word parallax means. Put one finger in front of your nose and another finger farther away. Close one eye, then open that eye and close the other. Your fingers will seem to move. This is called a parallax view. This TV series invites you to look at issues from fresh perspectives. Also, see much information about the issues that we cover in this TV series and previous episodes of this series at my blog, www.parallaxperspectives.org. And now I invite you to watch this month's program. This month's interview on Glen's Parallax Perspectives will help us understand how some big businesses are allowed to break federal laws and get away with it. Big business corporations have enormous wealth, so they also have enormous power. The federal government should be making them obey the laws, but instead, the government keeps refusing to hold them accountable. This hurts all of us and our health and our environment and our sense of having an honest government. One expert guest will help us explore this topic. Rick Claypool is a research director for Public Citizen. The website is www.citizen.org. That's the nonprofit organization that Ralph Nader founded in 1971 to serve the broad public interest and protect people and democracy from abuses by governments and big businesses. Rick Claypool's job is to focus on corporate crime and wrongdoing and the ways corporate power distorts democracy. He researches and reports on federal enforcement against corporations, deregulation, and conflicts of interest. Welcome, Rick. I'm glad that you are here.
Thank you so much for having me, Glenn. It's my pleasure.
Good. In recent decades, big businesses have gotten much bigger, and some huge businesses have bought other businesses, and some have merged. As a result, our nation's biggest businesses have become very much bigger and very much more rich and very much more powerful. They have greatly influenced or greatly increased their power over ordinary people. And sometimes, as we will explain during this interview, they break laws and get away with it. And Rick, before we get into the specifics of these issues, could you just please provide an overview of the escalating power of big business nowadays and how they abuse their economic powers? And then we'll follow up.
Thanks, Glenn. So, in a word, and maybe this is a technical word or a jargony term, but over the past several decades, the ideology of neoliberalism has prevailed from governments and corporations and that has led to their increasing power, increasing size, and sort of diminishing countervailing forces. So what this means when I say neoliberalism, right, is this idea that the profit motive sort of takes priority over all other things that a business could be doing, and not just in the terms of, we're going to sort of do the make the best product or provide the best service, but to the degree that the very structures of these of businesses are increasingly financialized and shaped to sort of maximize returns on Wall Street. And so what this means is that companies are increasingly buying up other companies, expanding and taking on other lines of business. It means they have also sort of influenced government and this sort of view in particular, in the '80s onward, has been that well, the job of the government is not to prevent companies from causing harm, but to get out of their way. And the result of that has been, extremely lax enforcement. In particular, when we talk about companies, getting bigger, and increasingly financialized, you're talking about lax antitrust enforcement. You're talking about companies sort of becoming, bigger and bigger, and then sort of exploiting the that size advantage in order to increase their power and sustain their power, and making it uh, almost impossible for smaller and emerging businesses to compete.
Right.
So
Yeah, right. So contrary to the rhetoric of free market competition, they're trying to squelch that and just dominate for their own greed rather than to have a fair economy with honest competition and a free market with lots of competing businesses. So we'll be following up on some of these implications of that. The interview here today focuses on crimes committed by big businesses. And before we get into those specifics, Rick, could you provide an overview of what kinds of crimes they commit and how much crime they commit?
sure.
Just an
So
overview.
right. Companies can, anything that's illegal for a person to do is illegal for a corporation to do. Now there are particular kinds of laws that are particularly focused on regulating companies. These are things like laws against, say, drug companies selling misbranded drugs, against fossil fuel burning companies from dumping pollution into our air and water, and manufacturing companies to make sure that their workers are kept safe. But other kinds of violations that companies can do. I mean, there's a whole range of frauds and misconduct that kills people, and that deceives people. There is the problem, of course, with these coming from big business, is that unlike an individual, the when companies break the law, uh, very often they are doing so at a scale that can cause truly catastrophic harms.
Yeah. And we'll get into some specifics during the interview. I want to do one other kind of a preparatory thing that would be an overview about regulation and law enforcement. Congress passes laws to achieve broad goals, and then the laws empower the agencies within the executive branch to work out the details and enforce the laws. But too often, those agencies that are responsible for regulating businesses seem to have been captured by those businesses, so they water down the requirements and they fail to take actions that the American people want them to take. And also, then, as you'll be explaining, the U.S. Department of Justice fails to enforce those laws. They just say, please don't do this again, and kind of let it go at that. And I appreciate your expertise, and I've read a number of things you've written about your understanding about the failure of the federal government to enforce the laws that big businesses keep breaking. And so I think that's just an important scope for people to see where we're going in this interview here. Rick, you've reported on the Justice Department's failure to prosecute big businesses that commit crimes. The Justice Department uses gimmicks that you've written about extensively called deferred prosecution and non-prosecution in order to allow big businesses to commit crimes, and sometimes over and over again without ever being prosecuted. So I invite you to share with us now some information and insights that you've gained from your research and that you've written about very smartly for the public to read. And I've read several of your articles. Could you explain this problem of these deferred prosecution and non-prosecution agreements that the Justice Department allows in those cases?
Sure. So there are these arrangements, there are deals basically, between prosecutors and companies that commit crimes that help companies avoid prosecution. Now, these, ironically, these are the kinds of of arrangements that have, historically were originally developed to help, first-time low-level offenders avoid, the very the severe and life-altering, consequences of going to jail. But the some I guess, the folks at the Justice Department have decided that, well, wait, what if we, take this thing that's sort of meant to help, the people who sort of at the bottom of the economic ladder and use them to help the top. So what happens is that whenever these a company is found to be breaking the law, they uh, you know engage in negotiations with federal prosecutors who are trying to bring the case and potentially threatening to bring charges. And what the these agreements, so we collectively call them leniency agreements, because that's the outcome, is that instead of actually being prosecuted to the full extent of the law, like generally federal prosecutors would to a someone who breaks federal law, they make these arrangements that basically say that, well, as long as the company promises to mend its ways, pay a fine, and be on its best behavior for some term of time, some 2 or 3 years usually, at the end of that term, the charges will be waived, and it will be like there was no criminal enforcement action at all. The record will be squeaky clean.
Mhm.
So what we have found is that while these arrangements are written generally in such a way that say, well, if a company violates their agreement, including by committing another crime, uh, the consequence of that will be there'll be prosecution for both the crime that the agreement was made over and whatever new subsequent crime. In reality, what happens, especially for the biggest companies, is that we see them entering multiple successive leniency agreements with the Justice Department, making the threat look pretty empty.
Yeah, I can imagine. Suppose you rob a bank, and they want to prosecute you, and instead of actually hauling you into court and prosecuting you for robbing a bank, you work out a deal with the prosecutor who says, "Okay, tell you what, um, I'll promise not to rob any banks for the next 3 years, and then you just don't prosecute me." Okay, and then the prosecutor allows that, and then after like another year and a half, you rob another bank, and you work out the deal with the prosecutor who says, "Well, don't prosecute me now. I'll promise not to rob any more banks." And they say, "Oh, okay." And then another year goes by and you rob another bank. And you just keep doing this. And I mean, they would not do this to bank robbers. You know,
That's
I
right.
want to show
That's
on the
right.
screen how the graph you've prepared about how this trend, um, how that those deals have gone from 1995 to the early 2020s. So we got up to about 300 of them in the year 2000, and they've been declining since then, as
Yeah. So
people
these
can
are
see.
yeah. So these are the actual. So these are the number of actual
The actual,
prosecutions.
I'm sorry, yeah, the actual prosecutions, and those numbers have been declining because of what you've said, and then some other factors as well. But the government is choosing not to prosecute big businesses. They're down to about a third of what they did a little over 20 years ago.
That's right. And increasingly, and also, in the, before 2003, they would still make these leniency agreements with companies from time to time. It was about maybe 1 or 2% of the time. It was a extraordinary circumstances, exceptional cases. But after 2003, it became an increasing share of the amount uh, of what they were doing. And basically, it became the default way of dealing with the biggest companies, to a point where it peaked at about a third of criminal cases against corporations were resolved through these leniency deals.
Yeah, and your research has shown that these lenient agreements do not deter those companies from breaking the laws again because they know they can get away with it. Yeah.
And companies,
Pardon me?
no, so yes, and it's important to distinguish. I mean, corporations are different from people in in their motivations for breaking the law and what they do. There are no corporate crimes of passion, right? They are
Yeah.
rational, risk calculating machines, and they respond very strongly to incentives and punishments.
Uh-huh.
Uh, and if without a strong enough punishment, if the risk of breaking the law seems like it's worth it in terms of the potential profits they could earn,
Yeah.
they're expected to break the law.
Yeah. And so they do calculate this, like you say, there's no crimes of passion. It's not like somebody shoots somebody because you were jealous about some guy dating your girlfriend, or you were just impulsive and shoplifted something uh without thinking about the cost benefit. What's the likelihood that I'd be caught and prosecuted and have to do time for this? Um, People do those crimes of passion, but the businesses calculate what are the odds that we can get away with this, and increasingly the odds are very great that they can get away with it, and so they do. I want to ask you about a couple of different parts of our economy. Uh, Big banks have been committing very serious crimes for a number of years. They keep breaking laws over and over again. Could you summarize, Rick, the kinds of crimes that Wells Fargo, for example, has committed? And then I'll ask you about some others.
Sure, sure. So Wells Fargo is a pretty egregious example. Um, over over a decade, they engaged in what has been called the sort of the cross sell scandal. Essentially, what happened was that executives at the company pushed just impossible sales goals on the workers, and who, uh, in order to meet those sales goals, were pressured to engage in all kinds of misconduct, including fraud and creating fake accounts. The result was that millions of Wells Fargo's consumers were had fake accounts or other sort of fraudulent activity occur on their accounts because the company was trying to inflate the appearance of how well it was doing and how well for investors, and so uh, the ultimate outcome of this fraud, again, this is a criminal um, uh, act, resulted in Justice Department brought a case against it, but resolved it again with one of these leniency deals. Um, so now, to be fair, the company, a number of executives at the company also faced individual consequences, and this is something we see over and over again, where sometimes what the enforcers will do will try to sort of balance this idea of, well, we'll go lighter on the company, but then we'll try to throw the book at some individuals, but it's not just you can't do this either or, because if there are systemic structural problems with
Yeah.
the company, you have to prosecute the company to really deter wrongdoing sort of system wide.
Right, right. Now there are several other big banks committed crimes, including J.P. Morgan Chase and a bank called HSBC. Can you summarize pretty briefly what they did? Um, Go ahead.
Sure, and those two, both J.P. Morgan Chase and HSBC, are notable for being sort of serial recipients of these kinds of leniency agreements. Um, J.P. Morgan, they engaged in sort of contract manipulations. They engaged in lack of oversight ahead of to what led to the Bernie Madoff fraud scandal. They violated the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act by using as sort of a personal favors. They would sort of hire friends and relatives of the Chinese government and their subsidiary there, in exchange for hopefully preferential treatment. Um, as for HSBC, I mean, they were particularly egregious in terms of their violations. They facilitated money laundering by Mexican drug cartels over a number of years. So much to the degree that there were the special deposit boxes that the cartels were using were sort of made sort of custom to sort of fit into the sort of the bank windows at HSBC. They also engaged in violated sanctions, U.S. sanctions that prevent financial dealings with companies that are considered to be antagonistic to U.S. interests. So we're talking about Iran, Cuba, Libya at the time, and these are serious violations that are considered to be part of this is the the country's sort of anti-terrorism efforts and that kind of thing.
Well, for as much as the federal government says that it's against drug crime, it allows banks to commit drug crimes and serve the drug cartels, and they get away with it. The federal government allows the big banks to do it, but they want to go after some guy on a street corner selling something. But the big banks with huge amounts of money, they get away with it.
Yeah,
it's a policy decision by the federal government. So I want to mention also that besides these actual crimes, these big banks did a lot of stupid, risky actions after they were deregulated. The banking lobby and the political conservatives stripped away some of the regulations that were imposed in the 1930s to protect the people and protect our economy from abuses by banks. So these regulations that were in effect since the 1930s actually did protect us, but the banking lobby and the political conservatives deregulated that stuff. And when the banks crashed our economy in 2008, the government bailed out the banks, but millions of Americans who lost their homes to foreclosure got practically nothing. So we just, again, need to see the different treatment for the haves versus the have-nots. Let's see. Big businesses in various parts of our healthcare system have committed serious crimes. And the worst drug dealers, as we've said, are actually big business corporations that also, besides the banks, they include pharmaceutical companies and some big retail chains. Rick, can you tell us something about examples of crimes committed by big businesses related to health, like pharmaceuticals or other aspects?
Sure. Well, I mean, one of the most, egregious offenses over the past in recent years is just the opioid selling fraud related to Purdue Pharma and this business run by the Sackler family. The company was allowing just enormous amounts of its opioid pills, OxyContin, to be just go. They were not keeping track of these things, right? Even though they had every instrument available to do so. They were, in fact, they were keeping track of things to the degree that whenever they noticed that certain physicians were prescribing just enormous amounts of opioids, they would concentrate on their sales efforts on those to get those physicians to sell more. This was the priority. Now, the company was subject to federal criminal enforcement action in almost a decade ago, maybe over a decade ago at this point, for its opioid sale practices. Again, it received a leniency agreement to sort of protect its ability to stay in business. Instead of deterring ongoing violations, the company continued its fraudulent marketing, just at a altered slightly, to the point that the opioid addiction crisis just swelled to where it has what it has become, and the company faced another ultimately was prosecuted by many accounts too late, and the the actual owners of the company who sort of drove its strategy, the Sackler family, they have continued to evade accountability, except some highly favorable settlements where that even if they wind up having to pay billions, they will remain billionaires.
Yeah. And I know I've read stuff beyond the scope of what we're talking about here from about other um, healthcare related companies, giant corporations that own nursing homes and really skimp on nutrition, healthcare, staffing, all kinds of stuff to inflate their profits. And even if those are not crimes, they are very distinctly abuses and they hurt public health. And I mean, that's just a bit of examples, but there's a lot more of that abuse that even don't rise to the level of criminality. But even those crimes are like what you've said, and there's lots more examples. If we had time, we could talk about those. I want to invite you to talk about Congress. For a very long time, people have been concerned that Congress has a huge amount of corruption in it. Congress keeps failing to take actions that the American people and our environment need, but because some big businesses do not want Congress to interfere with their big business profits, they pressure Congress to not take the necessary actions. So besides failing to pass necessary laws, even for those laws that Congress does pass, they water them down because of lobbying and financial pressures from the big corporations that fund the election campaigns. And when it comes to the Senate, that is required to be making decisions about confirming nominees for a lot of federal important positions, the Senate fails to confirm nominees. I mean, this has been a pattern in lots of parts of our public life. And also, a lot of members of Congress are millionaires, and many have serious conflicts of interest. For example, they're buying and selling stocks that they are making decisions about. If I'm a Congress member on some committee making decisions about what should the government buy, and I own stock in the companies that the government is thinking about buying from, that's a conflict of interest. And they keep getting away with it. And Congress keeps defying public opinion in failing to hold Congress members accountable. So that's a huge amount of thing. I want to mention something about regulatory agencies and ask you about that. As I mentioned earlier, Congress passes laws to achieve broad goals, and the laws empower the executive branch agencies to work out the details and enforce those laws. But unfortunately, big businesses use several ways to interfere with the agencies that are trying or supposed to be holding them accountable. Big business lobby them, and they fill the agency's upper ranks with appointees from the executive branch who have actually been working for the business agencies that those federal agencies are supposed to be regulating. And these and other ways, businesses capture those agencies and interfere with their abilities to protect the public and our environment and our climate. Rick, could you add anything about these concerns about regulatory agencies?
Sure. Well, yeah, no, it's something that I've definitely seen in my, research, and it's an ongoing concern. So in 2019, we saw at the Federal Trade Commission that 2/3 of the agency, which is the Federal Trade Commission, is, I should say, is like supposed to be the sort of primary sort of consumer protection agency, and also an agency that's shares responsibility with the Justice Department doing antitrust, anti-monopoly enforcement. We found that 2/3 of the agency's sort of top appointees had revolving door conflicts with big tech, and that 75% had revolving door conflicts with companies that the agency has responsibility for overseeing. Now,
And
we've seen
revolving door means what? Can you tell
Sure.
the viewers what revolving door concept is?
Sure. So the idea of the revolving door sort of is what was what you were describing, where you have individuals who go back and forth between working for the industry, and then they go and like they work in government, say at a regulatory agency, and then they go back to the industry, and they go back and forth and back and forth. Um, uh, Basically, sort of trying to play both sides of it, but in particular, often bringing a sort of industry perspective, viewpoints, and sympathies into that sort of government enforcement space in a way that sort of leads to much more oversight.
Thanks. Yeah. Um, Politicians keep trying to frighten the public about crime in the streets, and politicians do not tell us that white collar crime, business related crime, and so forth cost the American people much, much more than crime in the streets. And I read an article that you wrote, Rick, in which you reported that big businesses' white collar crime costs Americans between 300 billion and 800 billion a year, while street crime costs only about 16 billion a year. So big businesses, white collar crime costs the public 20 or 30 or 40 times as much as street crime. And can you tell us what kinds of things are covered by the white collar crime that hurt the American people?
Sure. Well, I mean, a prime example is wage theft, right? And that kind of violation. So, a recent study by the Economic Policy Institute found that just on wage theft alone is costing American workers $50 billion a year.
This is where an employee works for a company, and the company either doesn't pay them or pays them less than they're supposed to, and so it's basically a wage theft by the corporation.
That's right. That's right. And this is primarily occurring with with low wage workers and very large businesses, right? Like one of the biggest wage theft violations in recent memory was by Walmart, right? Which has is sort of infamous for having a vast and low paid workforce. So this is not only is this a huge problem of priorities, where you see these kinds of corporate violations that are much bigger and consequential, sort of society wide, but it's also the result of the lack of enforcing these kinds of laws results in this upward redistribution of wealth, from the poorest to the richest.
Yeah, yeah. In light of what you have been reporting, I remember there's a song that Woody Guthrie wrote and sang that includes this insight, quote, "Some will rob you with a six gun and some with a fountain pen." So he was onto this way back decades ago. Another thing that the politicians want to alarm people about is welfare. And politicians like to blame poor people for receiving welfare, but actually most welfare payments and subsidies go to big businesses. And even if when it's not a crime, because Congress has passed laws allowing huge amounts of welfare and subsidies to big business, it's often corrupt because of how Congress works. Big businesses give huge amounts of money to political candidates, and they spend huge amounts of lobbying. Poor people can't afford to donate to campaigns or to lobby. So when poor people collect welfare, they get blamed for it. But when big businesses collect huge amounts of welfare and subsidies, that's just business as usual. Is there anything you could add to this concept of welfare or that disparity?
Again, this is I guess it's another really excellent example of a massive redistribution of wealth from the broader public to the richest, the corporations. And it really is, the scale of it is just mind-boggling. It's really hard to, it's the kind of, there's not like a strict definition of corporate welfare that makes it like very easy to be like, look, comb through the budget and be like, okay, well, this is the exact amount that it is. But if you think of just a handful of policies that sort of transfer wealth to corporations, things like corporate tax cuts, things like not allowing drug companies to or not allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices with drug companies.
Yeah.
The privatization, partial privatization of Medicare and Pentagon pork, right? The amount,
Yeah.
all these goodies that go to defense contractors. We're looking at, somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.75 trillion in corporate welfare over the past 10 years.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the pork for the Pentagon. I live in Washington State, which has a lot of military stuff here, and our U.S. senators and House members keep bringing that money in. Decades ago, we had a very powerful United States Senator, Henry Jackson, who was known as the senator from Boeing. And he did a huge amount of work to bring billions of dollars into Boeing. And we have other politicians do this. The Navy does not want certain weapon systems that Congress funds anyway. So Congress is giving money to some military weapons manufacturers to build weapons for the Navy that the Navy doesn't even want. I mean, this is the extent of the corruption. It's just massive. And the F-35 fighter plane is just an enormously expensive boondoggle. The thing doesn't work, and Congress keeps throwing billions of dollars at it. Now, beyond the abuses from individual big corporations acting individually, these big business corporations also gather together through industry-wide organizations, energy companies, or high tech. You mentioned the high tech companies and stuff. And these industry-wide organizations pressure the government to allow them unfair benefits and even to get away with committing crimes. For example, the United States Chamber of Commerce is a huge entity representing lots and lots of big businesses, and they want weak regulations and little enforcement. Can you say something about how the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is involved with crimes committed by big business?
Sure. Well, yeah. So one paper I did sort of looked at, I guess I should, step back. So the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, is the sort of the biggest, sort of the big business lobbying juggernaut in Washington D.C. It is the biggest big business, lobbying and advocacy and litigating group, and they do not disclose who their members are, but some of their members do sort of self-disclose, and there have been ways of sort of figuring out, often this is reported to shareholders and things like that. So as far as we could figure out, we could, we were of the known chamber members, we found, numerous that have been the subject of, federal, criminal and civil enforcement actions. And at the same time, we see the chamber has put some of its most aggressive lobbying efforts targeting agencies that recently under Biden have been sort of trying to do the right thing and to really strengthen enforcement against corporations, even with the limited resources they have. So see the Federal Trade Commission and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau have been really, notably tried to ramp up their efforts to rein in corporate wrongdoing. And the chamber has, targeted these agencies specifically, accusing them of, abuse of power and all that kind of thing. Basically, every time they try to enforce the law against chamber members that are, accused of breaking the law.
Right. I want to mention something about another concern that I have, the mass mainstream media, and then we'll move on to discuss some international aspects. Mainstream news media are big, powerful forces, almost all owned by giant corporations, and they spread information and misinformation about what is happening. And by reporting some things and not reporting other things, the mainstream news media, largely corporate owned, strongly influence what people know and what people do not know. So the news media shape people's understanding about political and economic issues. News coverage of big business crimes is wildly skewed in favor of corporations and investors. News media fail to report on the actual harm that these businesses are doing to ordinary people and our environment, and they fail to hold the corporations accountable. And I want to mention just a couple of points here. Mainstream media, newspapers, and broadcasters are owned by a few giant corporations, and they run these not to promote honest journalism, but they run these as profit-making businesses, and they do whatever they can to maximize profits. That includes laying off journalists. Their reporting is biased in favor of big business. Newspapers will have a business page. Where's the labor page? They don't do that. Labor doesn't get a fair shake, even though the business page is written by people supporting business, but labor does not have a voice in the newspapers. We have fewer newspapers existing now. A great many journalists have been laid off, so we get less actual reporting. There's less reporting of local issues. So the forces that dominate local governments, like the real estate lobby and so forth, get to dominate what people know about issues. I want to ask you about some international stuff, Rick. We've been talking thus far about realities within the United States, and there are some international aspects too. I'll mention a couple, and then ask you about one aspect of this. We have a lot of big business that exists across nations, and they work their transnational operations for their benefit, even at the expense of people in each of the respective nations. Big businesses powerfully influence U.S. foreign policy. We commit wars for oil, and we've committed wars for all kinds of other economic interests. Abuses of the environment and the climate cause international damage, not just damage in the U.S. And some businesses exploit and abuse workers who are immigrants. So we have a business abuse related to the immigrant issues. So, Rick, I wonder, could you tell us something about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and that deals with business crimes in other countries? Can you mention that?
Sure. Yeah. No, thanks, Ben. So this is one that that companies really have to take seriously. It's also one that winds up, because it's about companies that are transnational, multinational. The biggest companies. It comes up a lot with companies receiving leniency agreements. So the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act essentially makes it illegal for companies to, whenever they set up operations abroad, to engage in bribery to advance their economic interests, and if they sort of to keep bribery out of their supply chains. Now, what winds up happening is where some of the biggest big businesses have run afoul of these violations, and again, it's the cost of doing business, right? So one particularly notable beneficiary of the sort of leniency with the enforcement against the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is Walmart, which was found. There was a New York Times expose that led to a lengthy Justice Department investigation, finding that Walmart was sort of engaging in sort of corrupt practices and on multiple continents. But the way that the investigation dragged on, and the way apparently Walmart, was able to sort of succeed in, arguing that even though it, violated this law, that it shouldn't face any consequences, it received it ultimately got a non-prosecution agreement for this, and it's that was particularly shameful because Walmart, one of the hugest companies in the world, benefited enormously by being able to basically accelerate its business growth through unlawful means all over the world. And by the time the regulators caught up, it was already established and profiting from these companies, these the stores that it built using means that it shouldn't have.
Right. Yeah. So what you mentioned here is something that very often happens. The damage has been done, and the businesses have been getting profits unjustly and illegally before the legal action occurs from the government, And even then, it's not enough to roll that back because the damage has been done. I want to mention something about labor, and I'll be posting more information to my blog about some labor issues related to our topic here, including links to stuff you've written about safeguards for workers that I appreciated reading those. In order to produce goods and services, businesses employ workers, and some businesses break laws that should be protecting their workers. And there's a lot of information out there. I'll have some links to my blog when I post this video to the blog. I'll post information there about that. But U.S. Department of Labor Wage and Hour divisions identified 835 separate cases of child labor law violations affecting thousands of children under the age of 16. And there's just lots more going on that I'll be posting to the blog. I want to mention another concern that I have about another business sector's abuses. The American people are alarmed that organized drug cartels produce and sell illegal drugs that hurt people. You've mentioned this, but what I want to lift up here now is why aren't the American people equally alarmed that big business corporations are producing and selling guns that hurt people? Even if it's legal to produce guns and sell them, those guns are knowingly used to commit murders and mass murders. You have these assault weapons, AR-15s, that are a military weapon, not designed for an ordinary guy to have to go out deer hunting, right? And not for self-defense in your home in case somebody breaks in. These are designed only to commit mass murders. And these gun manufacturing companies knowingly are complicit in those crimes of mass murders. Governments clamp down on illegal drugs, but Republicans prevent governments from taking sensible actions to protect us from gun violence. And many very sensible laws have been proposed to reduce gun violence, but Republicans keep preventing them from happening. And I believe that we need laws to hold accountable the businesses that manufacture and sell guns that are used for individual murders and mass murders. And even if those businesses do not pull the trigger, they're certainly accomplices in those crimes. So that's a point I wanted to make. I want to invite you to share briefly. We're running tight on time, but I want to mention a couple other things if you could briefly answer these. In 2018, 2019, two Boeing 737 MAX jets crashed and killed 346 people. A federal grand jury indicted a former high-ranking Boeing executive for fraud because he allegedly deceived the Federal Aviation Administration while it was certifying the 737 MAX jet. Could you say anything more about this briefly?
Well, I mean, that case, I mean, that is one of the instances where there was one of the more egregious leniency agreements with a company where the company was essentially the case that was brought under the Trump administration was for the was a fraud case that resulted in this agreement that really didn't ask much, which for this in exchange for this truly heinous and tragic event. Now, I think one of the more interesting developments that after that was because what because Boeing was charged with fraud when the sort of victims of the Boeing crash tried to hold the company and the Justice Department accountable for failing to notify them and involve them in the prosecutorial process as they're entitled to under the Crime Victims Act. What wound up happening was the Justice Department and Boeing together sort of making the case that relatives of the crash victims were not the victims in the case. That it was the government that was the victim.
Uh-huh.
Thankfully, in that particular instance, the families actually prevail. Although their efforts was to sort of reopen the leniency agreement with the goal of urging the Justice Department to fully prosecute the company. That is not
Good. No, that's information I had not known before. I've read some about this, and that's interesting stuff. I want to mention something here that has been in the news a lot. We've had a lot of railroad crashes, disasters in various parts of the world. And besides the recent one in Ohio, there have been a lot of these in the US and elsewhere. Some of those railroad disasters are based on extremely greedy management decisions about understaffing trains instead of having enough staff, and also deregulating federal rail safety rules. But there might be some crimes involved there too. I don't know. But I'll be posting some information about this to my blog when I post this video to my blog. Also, in the U.S., people have been angry about inflation, and there's solid evidence proving that businesses have simply been gouging consumers and covering up their greed by unjustly saying, "Oh, the workers are just asking too much salary, too high wages." But even if there are not actual crimes involved with the inflation, and there probably are in ways of things that you would understand, the businesses have at least been deliberately deceiving people about their responsibility for the inflation. Also, I want to mention, you had already mentioned tax cuts for the rich and big businesses. During several Republican administrations, Reagan, George W. Bush, and Trump, Congress cut taxes for big business and extremely rich people. And while those horrible tax cuts might not have been actual crimes, they did seriously hurt our nation by strangling the revenue stream. And that revenue cut gave Republicans an excuse to cut spending for things that we really need. And some of the dynamics that we're discussing during this interview came into play here while not actually crimes. So I want our TV viewers to think, besides crimes, think of really, really bad policy decisions. I want to move on from problems to solutions. Rick, we've been talking about problems, and I invite you to share some insights about some smart solutions. In some of my TV programs and on my blog, I've criticized the notion of corporate personhood, the Supreme Court's decisions that grant big business corporations the same human rights that the Constitution intended only for human beings. But because business corporations are treated as legal persons, they can be prosecuted, just like humans can. And do you see any potential for prosecuting the corporations as persons?
Right. So I mean that's essentially what's happening in that chart that I showed you. So those are corporate entities that are being prosecuted. Same way an individual would be prosecuted. However, there are a range of. I mean, obviously the numbers are declining and they're insufficient to the degree of corporate criminal misconduct. I mean, I've seen, there's a recent study that suggested that criminal misconduct is happening at major firms twice a week.
Uh,
It's so.
I need to interrupt where I just checked the time here, and we're running tight. I want to make sure we get a chance to put in a good pitch for the organization you work for.
Sure.
And so I'm going to move into that, and I'll mention some other things on my blog. I'm delighted that you work for Public Citizen. That's an excellent organization that I joined as soon as Ralph Nader founded it in 1971, and I've been donating financial support. Now Public Citizen has 500,000 members and supporters across the country. It's a nonprofit consumer advocacy organization that vigorously champions the public interest in the face of powerful governmental and economic entities. And the organization defends democracy, opposes abuses by big business, fights to make governments work for the people instead of working for big corporations. And they do everything they can to research and publicize issues. And you're part of that, of course. Mobilize people power, watch the government, and sue the government when necessary. The Public Citizen is not a partisan thing, does not deal with political candidates for office or take any money from governments or businesses. But I really enjoy reading the materials that you guys produce. And I encourage people to visit your website, www.citizen.org, to learn a lot more. We are disgusted by the status quo, and I also want to say I would encourage people to donate financially, as I've been doing for half a century. People are discussing with the status quo, but we need to change things. Besides protesting against what we don't want, let's organize from the grassroots up for things that we do want. And I'll be posting to my blog some efforts in that direction. The blog is www.parallaxperspectives.org. The word parallax has one R and two L's, PARALLAX perspectives.org. Visit the blog, click the TV programs link, and then click the title of this episode, Prosecute Corporate Crime to Hold Big Business Accountable. I'll be posting a lot more information, including links to articles Rick has written. A lot of information sources exist. I'll be posting a lot of stuff to the blog, and I encourage you to check that out. I want to thank Rick Claypool for sharing his information and insights with us. I want to thank the people who've been watching this TV program. We all want to live in a society that respects our rights, our health, our humanity, and our environment. We need to prevent big business from committing crimes that hurt us. Instead of allowing ourselves to be trapped as victims, let's join together with other people and with organizations such as Public Citizen and take smart actions to protect the broad public interest from being abused by powerful, greedy businesses. And you can get information about a wide variety of issues related to peace, social justice, and nonviolence through my blog, www.parallaxperspectives.org. We are all one human family. We all share one planet. We can create a better world, but we all have to work at it. And the world needs you. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thanks, Rick.